The words hit me before I even turned around. My son stood in the doorway, shoulders tight, eyes flat, and he said it like he was spitting out something sour. "Old man, you owe me everything." The room felt smaller after that. I had heard him raise his voice before, but this wasn't noise. This was something cold. I could feel it settle across my skin the way night air settles in an empty house. I didn't answer right away because I needed a second to understand if he really meant it. His stare didn't move. There was a thin line in his jaw I hadn't seen in years, pulled tight like he'd been holding something back for a long time. There was no frustration in his voice, no confusion, just entitlement, sharp and practiced, the kind that doesn't appear overnight. It sounded like he'd rehearsed it, like he needed me to hear every word and accept it without a fight. I waited for him to soften, but he didn't blink. I told myself not to provoke him. At 67, a widower with a quiet life, I'd learned that silence was often safer than engaging. But the silence after his words felt wrong. He stood there too still, too calm, as if he was waiting for a specific reaction, waiting to see if I would push back or fold. I didn't do either. I just watched him. And in that moment, I realized something inside him had shifted into a place I didn't recognize. He walked away first. No explanation, no reason, no look back. Just turned and left the room, as if he had delivered some official notice. The house felt heavier the moment he disappeared down the hallway. I could feel the echo of his tone sitting in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just an outburst, but the instinctive warning in me refused to settle. My son had spoken to me with hostility, not anger. Hostility has purpose. It has direction. When I went to bed, the house was too quiet. I listened to the steady tick of the clock and tried to focus on my breathing. But the thought kept circling back. That insult wasn't random. He wanted something, and whatever it was, he had already decided I owed it to him. I lay there in the dark longer than I needed to, waiting for the creak of the floorboards or the sound of him moving around the house. Nothing came, only silence, deep enough to make me feel like I was alone in a place I should have felt safe in. I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun lifted over the blinds. I made coffee out of habit, not appetite. The house still felt unsettled. When the phone rang, the sound cut straight through me. A number from my bank flashed across the screen. They never called that early. My hand hovered over the receiver for a moment, as if picking it up would confirm what I already feared. The voice on the line was polite but tense. They asked for me by full name. They asked if I could verify an urgent authorization request that had come through overnight. My throat tightened as I told the woman I hadn't requested anything. Paused in a way I didn't like, the kind of pause that meant she knew something I didn't. She said they needed to speak with me in person and that they couldn't give details yet. When the call ended, the silence in the kitchen felt heavier than anything from the night before. I stood there with the phone still in my hand, my coffee untouched, the morning light barely cutting the edges of the room. The insult made sense now. My son hadn't been angry. He'd been preparing for something. And whatever the bank wanted to discuss, I knew it wasn't good. A threat had moved into my life quietly, and it was sitting somewhere inside my own home. I sat at the kitchen table longer than I should have, watching the steam rise off coffee I didn't plan to drink. The phone call from the bank sat in my mind like a weight, pressing against the memories I had spent years keeping quiet. Losing my wife had carved out a space in this house that never filled again. And for more than 40 years, I worked, saved, and lived with a kind of discipline most people my age understood. I didn't expect comfort, only stability. I wanted something simple in my final years, not a fight inside my own home. Thinking about my son now, the pieces began to shift into place. His words from last night weren't sudden. They were the surface of something he'd been carrying for a long time. Entitlement doesn't grow overnight. It grows in the cracks someone refuses to repair. When he was younger, he used to joke about what he'd do with my money one day. I brushed it off as immaturity, but those jokes turned into assumptions, then expectations. And somewhere along the way, resentment slipped in behind them. I always thought it was normal tension, the kind families go through when life doesn't turn out how someone hoped. He bounced between jobs, never stayed in one place long enough to anchor himself. And whenever he struggled, he treated my savings like a safety net he hadn't earned. I gave what I could without encouraging dependence, but every dollar seemed to confirm his belief that my life existed to support his. Now, looking at that cold doorway where he stood last night, I realized he didn't see help. He saw inheritance, and he wanted it early. Over the past few months, something in him had shifted. He moved with a quiet confidence that didn't match his circumstances. He stayed out late, made phone calls in the yard, and started talking about investments he couldn't miss out on. Whenever I asked simple questions, he shut down or changed the subject. Money had become his favorite topic, but only when he was talking to someone else. With me, he acted like I was in the way. I remembered small things I ignored. A letter in the mail addressed to him with the return address rubbed off. A stranger who came to the door asking for him and left quickly when I said he wasn't home. His sudden interest in my paperwork, phrased as just helping you stay, organized. At the time, I told myself he was trying to be responsible. Now I could see he had been studying my habits, my weaknesses, and the things I kept in drawers I rarely opened. The question that kept circling my mind was simple and heavy. Why did the bank call me first thing in the morning? Banks don't call at dawn unless something is wrong. And they don't ask a 70-year-old man to come in for urgent authorization unless someone tried to change something they shouldn't. The timing was too sharp to ignore. One night, he tells me I owe him everything. The next morning, the bank calls about something I didn't request. My hand hovered over the phone more than once. I knew I needed to call them back, ask for details, confirm what they saw, but a part of me hesitated, not because I doubted the danger, but because calling them meant accepting the truth I had tried to avoid. If I asked the questions, I would have to face the answers, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear what my son had done in the hours after he insulted me and walked away without remorse. Still, the silence in the house made it clear. Pretending nothing was wrong wouldn't save me. I finally picked up the phone when the house felt too quiet to ignore the truth anymore. Calling the bank felt like stepping into cold water, but the woman who answered spoke with the same cautious tone as before. When I gave my name, she paused longer than necessary before saying they had received a large transfer request, but she couldn't disclose details until I verified the request in person. The way she emphasized in person told me everything I needed to know. Something had been attempted, and they didn't trust the voice on the other end anymore. I asked if the request came from inside my account or from a linked device, but she repeated the policy line in a careful voice. No details until they could confirm my identity. I thanked her and hung up, staring at the receiver long after the call ended. The mystery wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was calculated. Someone tried to move something big, and they wanted me blind until they could see my face. When my son came into the kitchen later that afternoon, he acted like the night before had never happened. He grabbed a drink, leaned against the counter, and started talking about an opportunity his friend had told him about. His tone was light, almost rehearsed, as if he was trying to read my reaction without being obvious. I told him the bank called. He nodded too quickly and said it was probably some system error. "They mess up all the time," he added, brushing it off like it was nothing. "But banks don't call me at dawn over nothing." As he talked, the cracks in his story showed themselves. He mentioned timing that didn't match what the banks said. He explained details I never asked for and avoided every question I actually asked. He kept shifting his weight, glancing toward the hallway, acting like he needed to be somewhere else, but was forcing himself to stay casual. It wasn't angry behavior. It was nervous behavior disguised as confidence. After he left the room, I went to my desk and opened the drawer where I keep old paperwork. I don't check it often, but something told me to look anyway. The stack wasn't the way I left it. A few papers were missing. Tax forms, a couple bank letters, and an old document with my signature on it. I stood there with the drawer open, trying to remember if I had moved anything myself, but the answer came too quickly. I hadn't touched those documents in months. Finding the empty space where those papers used to be tightened something inside my chest. It wasn't loud fear. It was quiet confirmation. This wasn't about a rude comment or a tense morning. My son had been inside my drawers, picking out the things he needed, taking only what would help him. That kind of precision wasn't accidental. I closed the drawer slowly and sat down, letting every recent moment arrange itself in my mind. The late-night footsteps, his sudden interest in finances, the strangers who came to the door, the shift in his attitude. None of it looked separate anymore. Each piece fit neatly into a pattern I couldn't ignore. I didn't need all the answers yet to understand I was being misled. Instead of confronting him, I decided to keep silent. Silence gives you space to observe. I began watching his expressions, the way he checked his phone, the the pauses between his sentences. I started noting small inconsistencies, things he forgot he'd said the day before or explanations that didn't connect. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about protecting myself without tipping him off. By the end of the day, the tension in the house had changed. It wasn't the confusion of the night before. It was the awareness that something was unfolding behind my back, and if I didn't pay attention, I would lose more than a few papers from a drawer. I spent the next morning moving through the house with a quiet purpose, the way a man does when he finally accepts that something isn't right. If my son had crossed a line, it wouldn't be in the obvious places. It would be in the small movements, the ones he didn't think I noticed. I started by retracing where he'd been that week, walking through each room and replaying the sounds I'd heard, the moments that felt out of rhythm. The kitchen cabinet he opened without reason, the hallway drawer he shut too quickly, the office door he stood near but never entered while I was watching. When I sat at my desk, I opened my email only to find several failed login alerts sitting unread. They were time-stamped around 2 or 3 in the morning, hours when I was asleep and the house should have been still. The same alerts showed for my bank portal. Someone had tried to get in repeatedly, guessing passwords close enough to unsettle me. My son didn't know I received those alerts. He was careless in the way people get when they think age makes you blind. I checked the porch camera next. I rarely looked at it unless a package went missing, but the footage showed more than I expected. Around 2:40 a.m., 2 nights before the insult, my son stepped outside. He wasn't taking a call. He wasn't getting air. He walked to the edge of the driveway, looked back at the house, and then disappeared out of frame for a few minutes before returning. The way he moved, quick but controlled, told me he didn't want anyone seeing him from the windows. He slipped inside quietly, unaware the camera caught everything. Seeing him like that, avoiding light, avoiding noise, avoiding suspicion, settled something in me. I went to the living room with a notebook and began listing every inconsistency since the night he called me old man. His tone, the missing paperwork, the strange confidence, the secrecy, the bank call, the failed logins, the late-night exit. Each note added weight to a pattern forming in front of me. None of this pointed to a confused son acting out of stress. It pointed to someone running out of options and seeing me as the easiest path forward. As I wrote, I realized something else. He hadn't looked at me like a father in months. He looked at me the way a man looks at a locked door he intends to open. Not with affection, not with respect, with calculation. Every conversation we had replayed in my mind, with new clarity. The questions he asked weren't about my well-being. They were about access, about information he didn't have yet, about weaknesses he hoped I wouldn't notice. Understanding this didn't bring anger. It brought a steady, controlled fear. Fear that sits low in the stomach, not loud in the chest. The kind that makes you sharper, not weaker. I felt older, but not helpless. There is a certain wisdom that comes with years, a patience that younger men don't expect. People think age slows you down, but what it really does is make you deliberate. I wasn't going to rush into confrontation. I was going to learn exactly what I was dealing with. By midday, the house felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because I finally understood the truth pressing in from the corners. My son wasn't just behaving recklessly. He was carrying out steps, a sequence, a plan that needed access, silence, and my trust. He already had the silence. He thought he still had the trust. A point of no return was settling in. Once a man sees danger coming from inside his own home, he can't unsee it. I set the notebook down, closed the porch footage, and sat still for a long moment. The search for truth wasn't cold anymore. It was necessary, and it was only going to get darker from here. The call came just after noon, right when the house had settled into that quiet that makes every sound feel sharper. A woman from a loan company introduced herself, her voice polite but carrying a firmness that made me sit up straighter. She asked if I could confirm the co-signed documents submitted under my name. For a moment, I didn't speak. The words didn't make sense. I told her I hadn't co-signed anything. Not recently. Not ever for my son. She paused, and that silence felt heavier than any answer she could have given. When she finally spoke, she said the documents carried my full name, birthday, and signature. I told her again, calm, steady, that I hadn't signed a thing. Her tone changed. She said someone would follow up with me and ended the call quickly, as if she realized she had already said too much. I set the phone down, feeling the air in the room shift. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't carelessness. Someone had taken my information and used it without permission. My son came in minutes later, almost as if he sensed the timing. He opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, made a small comment about the weather. I watched him, taking in every movement. When I mentioned the call from the loan company, he didn't even flinch. He let out a short laugh and said it must have been a scam. Happens all the time, he added, waving a hand like he was discussing junk mail. But he avoided eye contact, and the hand he waved lingered near the counter longer than necessary. I asked a simple question, whether he had applied for anything recently. He said no too quickly, too firmly. A clean lie delivered without thought, as if lying had become his new language. He tried to redirect the conversation, shifting topics in a sloppy, hurried way that made the truth stand out even more. His story didn't match the timeline, and he avoided every detail that mattered. When he walked out of the kitchen, he left the water bottle half open on the counter, like he forgot he was holding it. After he left, I went straight to the drawer where I kept my signatures on old documents. I compared the marks from years ago to the digital signature the bank had emailed last month for verification. The strokes matched too perfectly. Perfect because they weren't mine. They were copied, mimicked, the work of someone who studied how my hand moved and practiced until it looked identical. Seeing that forged line broke something quiet inside me. This wasn't disrespect. This wasn't tension between father and son. This was calculation. This was access. This was the willingness to cross a boundary most people wouldn't even approach. He had reached into my life with full intention, using my name as a tool for something I didn't agree to. The weight of what this meant hit me in one long breath. If he had co-signed a loan under my name, he could do more. He could empty savings, open accounts, redirect assets. My life's work, 40 years of effort, could disappear with a few signatures I never gave. Every safety I believed I had built felt suddenly fragile. The danger wasn't emotional anymore. It was financial, legal, real. I stood in the hallway, feeling the walls around me shift from familiar to foreign. My own home wasn't safe from my own blood. I needed the truth in my hands, not in suspicions or half-formed guesses, not in whispers or uneasy instincts. I needed proof. Cold, undeniable proof of what he had done and what he was planning. I went to my desk, opened a fresh notebook, and wrote one sentence at the top of the page. I need proof. I went to the bank the next morning without telling my son. Walking through those glass doors felt like crossing into a different version of my life, one where trust wasn't something I could rely on anymore. A manager led me into a small office and closed the door behind us. She spoke quietly, the way people do when they're afraid the truth might sound worse if said too loudly. She pulled up my account and turned the screen slightly, giving me a careful look before showing anything. There it was, plain and cold. Multiple attempts to transfer nearly everything I had. Not small amounts, not mistakes. Full withdrawals that would have wiped me out completely if the system hadn't flagged them as suspicious. I stared at the lines of activity, each timestamp like a small blow, landing in the same spot on my chest. The manager said the requests were stopped because the device didn't match my usual logins. When I asked what device it came from, she hesitated before admitting it was linked to an account with my son's name on it. My breath left me in a slow, steady exhale. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was fact. She continued speaking, explaining how the system flagged repeated attempts from the same device over several nights. She said the last attempt happened just hours before the bank called me. Her voice stayed steady, but I could see the concern behind her eyes. This wasn't normal. This wasn't confusion or a technical issue. Someone was trying to take everything I had with the persistence of a man who had run out of other options. They brought in an investigator from the fraud department. He shook my hand with a firm grip, the kind men use when they're about to give difficult news. He went through my statements, highlighting transactions I hadn't noticed before, small charges at odd hours, payments to online platforms I didn't recognize. Then he paused on one entry and asked if I knew anything about it. I didn't. That's when he told me what he suspected. Gambling sites. My son had been feeding money into them through small transactions, the kind meant to stay hidden. Hearing the word gambling didn't shock me the way it should have. It simply connected pieces I had been carrying separately. The late nights, the shifts in mood, the sudden attention to money, the secrecy. He wasn't planning for a future. He was scrambling to escape a mess he had already fallen into. And somewhere in that spiral, he had decided I was his way out. The investigator leaned back in his chair and said something I won't forget. Whoever did this knew your patterns, your habits, your schedule. He didn't say my son's name, but he didn't need to. The picture was clear. My son hadn't acted out of panic. He had studied me. He had planned. He had looked at my life, 40 years of saving, working, surviving, and seen a resource, not a father. That realization lodged itself deep, sharp, and unmoving. I felt something inside me shift, not breaking, but hardening. The shock didn't knock me down the way I expected. It settled in slowly, turning into a calm kind of resolve. I listened as the investigator explained the next steps, the protections we could set up, the alerts they would place on my account. I nodded, answering questions, signing forms, agreeing to safeguards I never imagined needing. By the time I walked out of the bank, the stakes were no longer theoretical. My life savings had been inches from disappearing. The danger wasn't hidden anymore. It was confirmed, documented, and connected directly back to my own blood. The walkway outside the bank felt longer than usual, and the air felt heavier, but I didn't feel helpless. The point of no return had already passed. I knew what I had to do next. I spent the afternoon moving through the house with a quiet, deliberate focus. Every step felt heavier than the last, but my hands stayed steady. The first thing I did was call the bank and lock every account behind new layers of protection. I added alerts, froze lines of credit, and placed restrictions only I could remove in person. From there, I contacted the credit bureau, then the fraud investigator, informing them of the new security measures and asking for additional oversight. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain more than necessary. A man my age learns that calm words travel farther. Once everything was secured, I sat at the table and drafted a simple message for my son. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional. Just a short note saying the bank needed to verify something with him and asked if he had touched any of my accounts recently. I read it twice to make sure it sounded harmless. Then I sent it and placed the phone face down on the table. Waiting for his reaction felt like waiting for a storm you can't hear yet, but know is coming. It didn't take long. The first response came fast, too fast. A single sentence asking what I was talking about. His words were sharp, clipped, written with the kind of urgency someone shows when they're afraid they've made a mistake. A minute later, another message arrived, longer this time, insisting he'd done nothing, doubling back on his denial, adding details that only made his lie more visible. When I didn't reply, he sent a third message, the tone shifting from confusion to irritation. The panic was in the spacing of his words. The anger was in the speed of them. I turned the phone back over and opened the recording app. Every message he sent, every slip in his tone, every contradiction, I saved it all. I kept the screen angled away from the hallway as I worked, aware of how quiet the house had become. The walls felt different now, like they were watching both of us. I didn't know when he would come home, but the air carried a stillness that made each sound sharper. It felt like living with a fuse that hadn't been lit yet. As the afternoon slid toward evening, my son's texts changed shape. They stopped pretending and started probing. He asked why I was acting strange. He asked what the bank told me. He asked if I had changed any important settings. The wording gave away more than he meant it to. He was worried about losing access, not about me. That told me everything. I walked through the hallway, checking the locks, letting my eyes settle on details I usually ignored. A scuff on the floor near my study, a drawer slightly open, the scent of his cologne still hanging near the stairs. The house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a place where someone had been hunting quietly, room by room, hoping I wouldn't notice the disturbances he left behind. The safety I once felt here had thinned into a thin line of tension stretched across each room. When the sun dipped low, I sat in the living room and let the weight of the day settle. The truth was clear now. My son wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was determined. And determination without conscience is dangerous. I felt the dread rising in my chest, but beneath it was something stronger, a steady determination that I hadn't felt in a long time. If he wanted something from me, he would have to face me to take it. I rested my hands on my knees, breathed once, and let the decision settle into my bones. Tonight, I face him. He came home after sunset, pushing the door open harder than necessary. The sound carried through the house like a warning. I stayed seated in the living room, hands resting on my legs, letting him see I wasn't avoiding him. He stepped into the doorway and stared at me with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've been acting strange," he said, voice low. "What did the bank tell you?" His tone wasn't curious. It was a test. I told him they needed to verify a request made under my name. His expression flickered. Not fear at first, but calculation. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, trying to look relaxed. "I told you. It was probably a mistake," he said. "These companies mess up all the time." But his foot tapped against the floor, and he kept glancing toward my study. He wasn't here to clear anything up. He was here to see if his plan had fallen apart. When I said I had visited the bank in person, his face tightened. "Why would you do that?" he snapped, the controlled tone slipping. I watched him carefully, letting the silence shape his reaction. He moved closer, lowering his voice. "You've been living off that money long enough. I need it. Now, you owe me that much." The resentment poured out of him with a bitterness that felt older than the moment. "You had your life. I haven't had mine." His words hit the room with a force that made my breathing slow. He stepped forward again, lowering himself to my eye level. "I'm drowning here, and you're sitting on everything. You think I'm going to wait for you to die?" His face hardened, and something darker slid into his expression. Anger mixed with entitlement, a kind of desperation that pushes a man past reason. I stood, meeting him with a steady voice. I told him I knew about the forged documents, the withdrawal attempts, the gambling debts. Each word peeled back another layer of the mask he'd been holding. His jaw locked, and the room went still. For a moment, he looked like he might deny everything, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped closer, voice low and sharp. "You weren't supposed to know," he said. "You were supposed to sign what I needed and stay out of the way." Then he reached for the drawer in my study, the one he thought still held the documents and passwords he needed. When he found it empty, something broke inside him. He spun toward me, eyes wide, breathing fast. For a moment, the threat wasn't subtle anymore. He moved with the kind of intent that makes your body react before your mind does. I backed toward the living room, keeping distance between us. The fear was real now, not imagined. His steps were fast and unstable, his voice rising in short bursts about being owed a chance, about me standing in the way, about needing everything now. I raised my phone and played the audio recordings, his messages, his contradictions, his threats. The sound stopped him in his tracks. He stared at the phone like it was something alive. The last of his excuses died in the space between us. He grabbed at the device in a panic, and in the struggle his voice rose loud enough to echo through the walls. That was when the neighbor knocked on the door, asking if everything was all right. My son froze. That pause was enough time for the police, already alerted by the fraud investigators' follow-up, to arrive at the driveway. Their flashlights cut across the windows, and the sound of their steps broke whatever grip he had on himself. He backed away, hands shaking, eyes wide with a realization bigger than fear. His downfall had come from his own choices. When the officer stepped inside and asked him to sit down, he didn't fight. The anger drained out of him, leaving something empty behind. As they led him out the door, he didn't look back at me. I stood there in the quiet that followed, the truth of who he had become, settling over the room like a shadow that had always been there, waiting to be seen. The house was still when the police car pulled away, leaving only the faint reflection of its lights fading from the window. I stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet return, piece by piece. An officer stayed behind to take a full statement, his questions steady and respectful. He didn't treat me like a helpless old man. He treated me like the victim of a crime, and somehow that steadiness helped me breathe again. They explained the charges: fraud, attempted theft, identity misuse. The investigator I had met at the bank arrived soon after, reviewing the evidence on my phone, the documents, the timestamps. He confirmed what I already knew. My son's actions were not misunderstandings. They were deliberate attempts to break into my accounts, forge my identity, and drain every dollar he thought he could reach. Hearing the words spoken out loud made the truth sharper, but it also brought a strange kind of relief. At least the guessing was over. The bank called again early that evening. They had secured every account, locked every transfer, and marked my file for high-level monitoring. Their fraud department would pursue charges as well. They reassured me that none of the attempts succeeded. Not $1 had left my accounts. The safeguards I put in place had held. As the representative spoke, I realized how close I had come to losing everything. 40 years of careful saving could have vanished in a night. Once the house emptied of officers and investigators, I walked through each room slowly. The floors creaked under my steps, the same as they always had. But the air felt different. The danger was gone, but the memory of it lingered in the corners. I picked up the water bottle he'd left on the counter, the one he forgot in his panic, and set it in the trash. It was a small act, but it felt like reclaiming something inside my home. Sitting down in my armchair, I let the reality settle in its full weight. The extent of his manipulation wasn't just in the documents or the bank attempts. It was in the way he watched me, the way he studied my habits, the way he tried to make himself invisible at the right moments. He hadn't slipped into this behavior. He had planned his steps. That understanding landed harder than any confrontation we had. My son had looked at my life not as something to respect, but as something to harvest. But even with that truth pressing against my chest, I didn't break apart. There were no tears, no collapse, just a steady, sober acceptance that the man he had become wasn't shaped overnight. The debts, the anger, the resentment, they had hollowed something inside him long before this week, and I had missed the signs, not because I was blind, but because I believed he still carried some part of the boy I raised. That belief had kept me vulnerable. As the night grew deeper, I started making changes, not out of fear, but out of necessity. I installed new locks. I updated passwords. I filed additional protection forms with the bank and credit bureau. I scheduled a home security review for the next morning. Each step felt like laying bricks back into the foundation of my life, one piece of safety at a time. I wasn't rebuilding trust. I was rebuilding dignity. There's a difference. By the time I turned off the last light, the house felt like mine again. Not fully repaired, not fully calm, but grounded enough that I could walk through it without looking over my shoulder. My son's choices had set this chain in motion, but I wasn't going to let them define the rest of my days. Justice had begun its work, slow, quiet, unforgiving, and I was ready to face whatever came next with the same steadiness that carried me through everything before. The days after his arrest moved quietly, almost too quietly, giving me more time than I wanted to sit with the truth. I walked through the house each morning with the same routine I'd kept for years, but now every familiar corner carried a shadow of what I missed. Silence had been my comfort for so long that I didn't notice when it turned into blindness. I trusted my son because trust felt like the right thing to give. I assumed blood meant safety. I assumed presence meant loyalty. I learned too late that silence can hide danger just as easily as it hides peace. Looking back, the pattern had been slow, patient, and obvious only in hindsight. His jokes about inheritance, his frustration when I set boundaries, the way entitlement settled into his voice long before things became dangerous. It didn't appear all at once. It grew in small pieces, small requests, small resentments, small slips in respect. I mistook each one for a passing moment. I treated them like a phase, but entitlement doesn't fade when you ignore it. It grows into something that believes it deserves what others earned. I think about that now with a steadiness that surprises me. There's no guilt in it, just clarity. A man my age has lived enough life to understand that trust is not a weakness, but misplacing it can break you. I trusted my son because I wanted to believe he carried the values I tried to teach him. But he built a different foundation for himself, one made of shortcuts, desperation, and the belief that I owed him a life he was unwilling to build. The hardest part wasn't discovering what he had done. It was accepting that he believed he had permission to do it. That realization forced me to see the world with sharper eyes. If there is one thing I can offer anyone listening to this story, it's this. Your instincts speak long before danger arrives. When something feels off, it is not paranoia. It is experience trying to protect you. Trust it. Trust yourself. And take steps that secure your future before anyone else decides to use it for their own. Healing, for me, didn't come from understanding him. It came from understanding myself, accepting that I deserved safety, that my age didn't make me helpless, and that boundaries are not barriers. They are acts of self-respect. I changed the locks, strengthened my accounts, and rebuilt the small systems that keep my life steady. With each step, the house felt lighter, not restored, but reclaimed. I don't look toward reconciliation. That isn't the ending I seek, and it isn't one he earned. Some actions draw lines so deep they cannot be erased by apology or time. My healing comes from acceptance, not reunion. I can care for the memory of who my son once was without accepting the danger of who he became. Those two truths can exist side by side without conflict. Most people think aging means stepping aside. I've learned it means stepping carefully. The world changes around you, but you don't have to surrender your security to keep peace. You can love, but you must protect. You can give, but you must guard what keeps you alive and standing. So I leave you with the lesson I earned the hard way, the one I want every older man or woman to hear clearly. Love your family, but secure your life. Trust is a gift, not a guarantee. And protecting your future is not selfish. It is necessary, especially when the danger comes from the people you never thought would bring it to your door.